welcome to Leading Entrepreneurs of the World. My name is Glenn Turansky, and I'm a member of the advisory board here at One Business World. And we welcome you to our Leading Entrepreneurs of the World platform. Leading Entrepreneurs of the World features entrepreneurs, founders, and business leaders presenting on cutting-edge topics and the latest in industry developments. Our goal is to provide the global business and entrepreneurial communities with a window into the minds of those shaping the future of the world. Today, we're very pleased to welcome leading biomedical engineer, professor, educator, author, and serial entrepreneur, Dr. Eric Ledet. Dr. Ledet is a biomedical engineer with 25 years of award-winning translational research experience, 20 years of consulting for the medical device industry, and 10 years experience as a serial entrepreneur in the medical device sector. Eric's also an award-winning educator who has developed curricula and taught courses on design, product development, and technology transfer. He has served on the medical advisory boards of multiple medical device companies, and he has also served as a grant reviewer on 7 SBIR study sections for NIH and NIDILRR. Dr. Ledet is the Chief Science Officer and co-founder of ReVivo Medical. He is also the Vice President of Research and Development and the Director of Health Innovation Incubator at the Center for Disability Services in Albany, New York. Dr. Ledet is also an Adjunct Professor in Orthopaedic Surgery at the Albany Medical College. Prior to his current roles, he was Professor in Biomedical Engineering at RPI and the Research Scientist in the Rehabilitation R&D Service at the Stratton VA Medical Center. Dr. Ledet is also the co-founder of IO Surgical, inSense Medical, and Proactive Innovations. Eric, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. We look forward to hearing more about generating value for acquisition in the medical device space and some more about ReVivo Medical as well. So let me turn it over to you, and I'll be back with you on the back end of the chat. Thank you.
Excellent.
Welcome.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for the very nice introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So it's a real pleasure to be here today and to be able to share with you. As Glenn said, I'm Eric Ledet. I am Chief Science Officer and co-founder of ReVivo Medical, which is an early stage startup in the orthopedic space, specifically in the spine space. And I also serve as Vice President of Research and Development and Director of the newly founded Health Innovation Incubator at the Center for Disability Services in Albany, New York. And I'll be talking today about generating value for acquisition in the medical devices space. And as Glenn just said, I have a background. See if I can get the slides to go. Here we go. I have a background in both academics and as an entrepreneur. I am a biomedical engineer, and my background is primarily in orthopedics and orthopedic devices, and so I'll use those as some examples today in the discussion. And you can see a little bit of my background here, as you heard in the introduction. So what I'm going to talk about today, and give a little overview, is some exit options for early stage medical device startups. And among those options, of course, is acquisition. And so we'll talk a little bit about when a strategic partner might be interested in acquiring the startup, and importantly, how to add value as a startup for acquisition by a big company, by a strategic partner. And specifically, we'll talk about the major milestones of demonstrating need, developing an intellectual property portfolio, establishing efficacy and safety, obtaining regulatory clearance or approval, depending on the type of device, defining a pathway for reimbursement, and establishing manufacturing channels. And these are all very significant milestones that, in my experience, larger companies are looking for and things that they look for to add value for acquisition. So before we get into this, I'd like to start at the end, and that's where this starts. Thinking about the strategy for adding value really starts with thinking about the strategy for an exit. There are, of course, many different ways that a medical device startup company can make money, and the strategy for building the value along the way is highly dependent on the exit strategy. And so there's a number of considerations that a startup might be thinking about with respect to exit strategy. And I think this is very important for any startup to be thinking about at the very beginning. And in particular, how long before the company becomes profitable, or how long until the company wants to have an exit. Some startups are started and established, and they're there for the long term. Companies want to grow and compete with the Johnson & Johnsons, the Medtronics, the Abbotts of the world. It takes a long time to get there. And sometimes founders of a startup company may want to have a much quicker exit, a much shorter exit. So another consideration is how much investment is going to be necessary to get to that profitability or to get to an exit of that startup. And of course, the more investment there is, the more likelihood there is of dilution of the founders. And so ultimately, in the end, the founders have less ownership, and also dilution of the early investors. And early investors may get on knowing that they're going to get diluted, but obviously the more investment that gets in, the more those early investors may get diluted. And of course, then the expertise of the management team itself. And having a strong management team who has really good skills in the startup world is not necessarily the same skill set for scale up. And it's sort of analogous in the United States to the Marine Corps versus the Army. The Marines are there for a very quick response. They establish a beachhead, and then generally they're out. And for longer term work, the Army comes in and they set up, and they're generally more well prepared for much longer time frames. And so a startup and exiting early on can be analogous to the Marines, whereas scaling up is more analogous to the Army. And of course, one of the other big considerations is ultimately the goals of the founders, the executives, and the investors. Are they in it for the long haul, or are they more interested in a rapid exit for whatever reason to perhaps move on to the next big thing? So one of the options for an exit is to compete in the marketplace by growing the company value and doing that through scaling up the business and ultimately sales. So going in and competing with other companies that are already in this market space. And of course, that can require hiring a marketing team, bringing in people who have expertise in the marketing part, and hiring a sales force. And not only hiring the sales force, but also having the company then invest time, the time and the resources that it takes to win that initial customer base. I mean, just because a sales force doesn't come on doesn't mean that customers are going to be there the next day. And oftentimes for an existing product where end users, if they are physicians, they might be using a particular product, it might take months to convince them to actually switch products. And oftentimes 5 to 10% of revenue goes to sales and marketing budgets. So this is a big commitment: marketing, hiring marketing, and sales force. Now, some of this cost can be mitigated by working with a distributor. And so the upside of that is that the company's not committing to hiring a sales force. But the downsides of that are that the distributors generally have other products to sell made by other companies. And although the company, the startup is not necessarily hiring the distributor, they do pay a higher commission for that distributor. So one of the other big factors is the requirement for scaling up for manufacturing. So if the startup company is going to go and actually market and sell the product, they may have to invest in in-house capabilities to scale up for manufacturing. And that can involve significant non-recurring engineering costs to set up those manufacturing systems and new equipment. If the company decides to go with contract manufacturers for the scale up instead of doing it in-house, the downside of that is that there's less control over the lead times, less control over processes and changes, and the need to make sure that there's some redundancy in the system. You know, if there are supply chain issues, that there's another manufacturer who is lined up and ready to go so that the supply chain is not disrupted. So there are a number of different factors and considerations with growing the company through sales and scale up. Now, of course, why would a company want to go this route? Because ultimately this can build a lot more value over time. If the sales of the products are successful and they build a market share, that's where a company in the long term adds a lot more value. Long term, more value. So of course, the second option is an early exit by selling or licensing the company or the technology to an existing manufacturer, a big company. This is, of course, potentially an earlier exit for the founders and the early investors. So they're not waiting as long to get a return on their investment. And of course, less dilution if there's less investment that's made after the early investors get in. Obviously, this helps to keep the team lean without having to hire sales and marketing people and reduces the human resource burden. I think that this strategy is very favorable for more technical founders. Again, I'm a biomedical engineer. I don't know too much about sales and marketing, but the technical aspect of things and something that I'm very comfortable with. And so for someone like me who wants to found a company and really focus on the innovation part, doing an early sale or license is a way to move through the product pipeline, keep innovating, or perhaps sell the company and move on to the next big thing. And even though an early exit may not be as big of a return, it may not be as much value, a successful exit, large or small, certainly builds credibility. And so for an entrepreneur or for a leadership team of a startup who's going to want to go on to the next big thing, the successful exit will really help with that next step as well. So the $1 million question, or maybe we'd like to hope the $10 million question, or perhaps if we're really good with our startup, the $100 million question, if the new company is looking for an early exit, how does that company, that small company, that startup, add value for acquisition? How can that new company achieve peak value without going to that scale up? So achieve peak value before going to scale up. How do we achieve that value for acquisition later on? What does the big company want? Where do they see value in the small company? So let's talk about when a big company might be interested. So I work with a lot of surgeons. I have many times had surgeons literally come to me with a napkin drawing and say, this is it. This is the million, billion, gazillion, whatever dollar idea. And I'm going to go to a big company and show them this. And the question is, will they be interested? Will they understand the value of this? And the question of will they be interested, the answer is likely they will not. They will not, because it's so preliminary. This is an idea, it's a concept. There's a lot of development that needs to go into this, perhaps years, perhaps millions of dollars. There is a lot of risk that this may fail. And just from this napkin drawing, although it may be an excellent idea, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be an innovative product. And so generally the response of a big company to the napkin drawing is no, they're not interested at this time. One of the other things is that I think where big companies are not interested is perhaps in the demonstration of a cool new technology. And I specifically mean a technology, not specifically a product. And I'll give you an example of this from some experiences that I've had myself. So I was part of a company that developed wireless implantable sensors. You can see a picture of one of the prototypes there. These sensors were small, they're wireless, they're batteryless, they're very simple and inexpensive. They can be fabricated in all different configurations on flexible substrates, as you can see in the video here. And these sensors can be configured in different ways to measure things like pressure or force or temperature or pH. And so we went to some of the big companies that were in the space that we thought would be interested in this technology for implantable sensors. We showed them different configurations of the sensors, including ones that could be injected into the body, other ones that could be placed surgically with implants. And we talked to them about how this was a platform technology. It could be used in monitoring intracranial pressure and spine applications, detecting infection, fracture healing joints, and even something that happens after extremity trauma, which is called compartment syndrome. And we thought that this was an absolute blockbuster and that the companies would be very interested in it. And what they came back is they said, this is a very interesting technology, but where is the product? It's not a product. A technology is not a product, and big companies are interested in products, not necessarily technologies. So will a big company be interested in this? No, not when it's a technology, not before it is a product. And this is, something that I say beware to engineers and scientists, that just because the technology is new and different and potentially very cool doesn't necessarily mean that it has value, especially to a big company. They are specifically looking for products for which they can do a market analysis and figure out exactly what the value is. Technology, too early. All right, so why doesn't the big company want early stage idea? Shouldn't they want them? I mean, when something has a lower value, it's earlier stage, it actually costs them less. So why wouldn't they want to get in when things cost less? So the challenge is, so the good side of this is that with an early stage acquisition, a big company would have more control over the development of the product or products that they have acquired. They can help to coordinate and develop other synergistic products or complementary products that might be part of their portfolio, or to make modifications or to existing products, or to figure out how the new product will fit into their overall portfolio. And ultimately to help develop marketing and sales strategies very early on in the development stage. So these are all advantages of an early acquisition. A big company acquiring a small company at the earlier stage. But they generally don't want early stage ideas. So why wouldn't they? And the short answer is that there's a lot more risk associated, obviously. Early stage acquisition has a number of disadvantages. And in my own experience, acquisition managers or teams for large companies, they really have more to lose by a failure than they have to gain by a winner from an early stage acquisition. And so most of them don't see a lot of value in that early stage. I know that the large companies are approached all the time, sometimes daily, with quote unquote opportunities of outstanding potential new products from startups, those napkin ideas that come day after day. And quite frankly, there are too many opportunities in the early stages for them to vet all of them. And so the easiest thing is to just turn away the earlier stage ideas. And big companies generally are not as efficient or nimble at bringing new products, differentiators through development. Small companies may actually be more efficient at doing that. So it might take a long time and be expensive for a big company to develop a product if they get it through an early stage acquisition. So these are all disadvantages, reasons why the big company does not want to acquire a new company at the earlier stages. Most big companies are going to prefer to wait. It's easier for them to wait until a new product, or a startup company matures. Once it matures, then they can vet it. They can decide whether there actually is a market opportunity here, whether it's a good investment. And at this point, of course, there's a lot less risk for the big company. Of course, there will also be a natural attrition of ideas, of those hundreds of ideas that come on the napkins to the big company. At most, a handful of those are going to actually make it through to products. And so there's much fewer opportunities, much fewer potential products for the new company to have to vet and sift through. And so it becomes easier for them to determine the success or failure, easier to determine the value, and quite frankly, fewer of them to evaluate. So most big companies are prepared to pay more later, even though it may be much more expensive, much more costly to them to acquire a technology that they could have gotten early on. They're prepared to pay more later if there's still a likelihood of a return on the investment, even if it's a much smaller return. And this is generally the philosophy of most big companies with respect to acquisition of smaller companies. There are some exceptions for this. There are some opportunities for early partnerships between a startup and a big company. And one is if the startup has an absolute game-changing product, which also happens to coincide with big companies' internal development priorities. And the game-changing product alone is probably not enough to attract the attention of a big company. But if it happens to coincide with some development priorities, then there's a likelihood that there might be a match there, and the big company may be interested in acquiring the new company sooner rather than later. There's also partnerships through incubators. If some of the big companies, if big company has an incubator, for example, Johnson & Johnson over the last several years has established the J-Labs program, which is a number of new product incubators sprinkled across the United States. These are small startup companies that move into the incubators and get some guidance while they're in the incubators. But Johnson & Johnson targets these specific areas. And I got this graphic directly from the JLab's website, where they're specifically their areas of interest coincide nicely with Johnson & Johnson's product lines, consumer, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. And so Johnson & Johnson sees a lot of these companies as potential strategic acquisitions later on, and that's part of the vetting process for JLabs. So there is potential for an early partnership between an early stage company and a big company. And then of course, a lot of the big companies do offer grants. And some of these grants may be for research, some of them may be for product development, for establishing products that, again, might be a strategic acquisition later on. Usually there's very little commitment. These aren't generally for large sums of money, but they help to establish a relationship between the new company and the big company. So if you're a startup, at what point will big company be interested in acquisition, and how does the new company add value so that at the right time value is maximized and peak for acquisition? And this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what adds value for acquisition. And I'm going to focus on 5 different things and then add a 6th one in there, which is also important. The first is demonstrated market need and end user acceptance. The second is intellectual property protection, patents. The third is efficacy and safety. The fourth is regulatory clearance or approval in the United States, depending on the type of device. The fifth is reimbursement. And then finally, a couple of important points with respect to manufacturing. So let's start with demonstrated market need and end user acceptance. So obviously, every startup needs to demonstrate a market need. And as part of every startup's business plan, they should be able to identify what the unmet market need is that they are going to fill, where the pain, if you will, is with the competitor products. And I don't mean literal pain, I mean where the limitations are with existing products, or are there no products in the space at all? And that's a limitation. And also what the competitive advantages are from the product or products that new company adds to this. So of course, this is all part of any company's business plan. But the real question, even after seeing this, that a big company wants is, how do they know, how does big company know that end users are actually interested in new companies' products? How do they know? And so I think that if that answer is yes, are end users interested? How do we demonstrate this? And the way to do that, I think a very effective way, is through testimonials. Letters from key opinion leaders on their letterhead, whether that's their private practice, whether that's their academic or hospital affiliation, if they're a physician, whatever it is, but letters from key opinion leaders who are end users of the product. And not just 1 or 2 letters per se, for example, or 1 or 2 key opinion leaders, but rather multiple ones in different representative markets. So for example, getting one in Boston and one in Atlanta and one in Houston and one in Chicago and one in Seattle and one in San Diego, you know, whatever. If those are end users who represent the potential market in different geographic areas, that can actually add a lot of value. And what I found is that videos are actually even more powerful than letters. Right, we all have cell phones. We're all walking around with a video camera in our pocket, and getting a key opinion leader, end user, to actually speak into the camera and talk about how interested they are in the product, that can have a lot of value, showing that later on to a big company. And of course, even better than a video is a live testimonial, bringing those clinicians, those end users, to pitches or meetings or ultimately negotiations with the big company, and having them extol the virtues of new company and new company's products. Now, this can be challenging, right? How do you get clinicians to travel to meetings for you? Well, we have a lot of platforms now for virtual meetings, so that can be helpful. Or, you know, being very strategic and holding meetings with strategic partners, with big companies at national conferences where everyone is going to be anyway. For example, where clinicians are going to be, if it's a medical meeting, clinicians are going to be there, big companies are going to be at that same meeting. Maybe even members of the new company's medical advisory board are going to be there. Everybody is already in the same geographic location. Set up a meeting, get everybody there together, get those key opinion leaders to help to talk about the value of the new company. So I think those testimonials are important. And I think also getting surveys. If there's an opportunity to get contact information, email addresses, or whatever it is for, let's say, members of a particular professional society who are end users, sending out a survey to them and getting responses back, I think that can be very powerful as well. One of the things that I would suggest is engaging a consultant if you have the opportunity to send out a survey, because the language on a survey, if that's not done properly, the questions can be ambiguous, the answers can come back ambiguous as well. But these things can be very powerful and add a lot of value for demonstrating end user acceptance, which is one of the things that big companies want to see. All right, let's talk about intellectual property, patent protection, essentially. And there's a lot of steps in this process, and could talk for hours or days just about IP and an IP portfolio. So the first step, which is very easy to do for a startup, is to file provisional patents. For filing provisionals, there are really no attorneys are needed to do this process. All the fees all in right now for filing a provisional patent in the United States are $150 for a small entity. And provisional patents provide some protection for 1 year. And so based on this, I would encourage any new company, if they want to add value, to file as many provisional patents as they can, as are appropriate during the earliest stages of development. Taking those provisionals and then converting them to non-provisional, to regular, if you will, patents, both in the United States and PCT, Patent Cooperation Treaty, which is basically international patents filed as well. This adds expense, it adds some complexity. There are attorneys' fees that are going to be involved in this. But for most startups, the intellectual property portfolio, the patent portfolio, is all of the value of the company. And so filing patents becomes very important. Unfortunately, right now, even in the United States, from the time that a patent is filed until it gets the first office action, basically the first review of the patent, is averaging like 24 to 30 months. And for international patents through the PCT process, it's even longer than that. So there's a long time to wait between when a patent is filed and when that patent may be reviewed or examined or even issued. And so during that time, to help add value during that gap, a patentability opinion can be obtained. Reputable IP law firms that specialize in these things can review the prior art, they can review the patent applications, and they can offer an opinion on patentability. And this can add value, not as powerful as having a patent issued, but in that interim, in that gap, this can actually add a lot of value for a startup company. Obviously, once a patent is issued, that becomes a time to celebrate and becomes an asset for the company, an actual tangible asset for the company. Question is, not all patents are created equal. How big of an asset is this? How many countries does the patent protect in? Is this just a US? US is the largest medical device market in the world, but there are other markets outside of the US that are also large. The decision on what other markets outside of the US should really be made based on cost versus value. And I'll give one example of that. In Japan, the medical device market is it's large. It's certainly within the top 10 in the world, probably within the top 5, depending on what metrics you look at. However, filing and prosecuting a patent in Japan is extremely expensive, multiple times what it costs to do that in the United States and in countries in the European Union. And so a question for a startup might be, how much value does that patent actually have in Japan versus EU versus United States? Obviously, the more countries where there's protection, the more value that brings, but it comes at a cost as well. So the value of the patent is also largely dependent on the breadth of the claims. The claims is what actually describes what is protected by the patent. And if the claims are very narrow and only protect the preferred embodiment, the product that is going to market for NewCo, that is not as valuable as if those claims might be very broad and cover a whole spectrum of different products should somebody come in and try to develop a competitor product to the one that's protected by that patent. So the breadth of the claims can actually add a lot of value to a patent as well. And then whether that patent family is left open or not. And this is something that's largely overlooked by a lot of startups if they don't get good counsel from a patent attorney. What leaving the patent family open means is that once a patent is filed, and if that patent is going to be issued, there's an opportunity to file continuations to expand the claim set. And so a patent that has a handful of claims when it's initially awarded can actually be expanded and expanded and expanded through continuations and continuations in part. And one thing that I would highly recommend to any startup is once notification of allowance comes, that's where you get the notification from the patent office saying you are going to be issued the patent. I highly recommend a celebration. It's a great feeling. But then to file continuations to keep the patent family open. And what that also does is it means at the time of acquisition, if a big company is going to come in and is interested in a new company, if patent families are still open, they can continue to expand the claim sets, and that adds a lot of value to the patent process. So again, patents are assets. The size of that asset depends on a few different caveats. One of the other things that's very important with intellectual property protection is freedom to operate and obtaining a freedom to operate opinion from a reputable law firm. Freedom to operate is different from patentability, and a company can have a whole lot of patents issued and not be able to take any of those products to market. All right, so let me explain, because again, I think this is something that's overlooked often by startup companies. Talk about freedom to operate versus patentability. These are two very different things. And what freedom to operate means is, does your invention practice all of the aspects of a claim or claims of an active patent? So a company could be awarded a patent, but it might still practice all the claims of another active patent. Now, you might think that that doesn't make any sense. Let me give a couple of very mundane examples of how something like this can happen. All right, so here we have a three-legged stool. So let's say this is my invention, and I have in my claim set that I'm describing an object that has a relatively horizontal upper surface that is used for a person to sit on, and extending down below that horizontal surface are three legs that extend down at angles, outward angles, and make contact with the floor. All right, so those are my claims. So it's a three-legged stool, and let's say that meets all the requirements for patentability, which of course in reality it would not, but let's assume for this example that it does. And so I get a patent awarded on my three-legged stool. Somebody else comes along and they say, hey, I have this great idea, and I have an idea for a four-legged stool, and it has many attributes that make it superior than a three-legged stool, and whoever first created the three-legged stool would not have thought of the four-legged stool. So I'm going to apply for a patent, and that patent is going to have claims that say horizontal surface that's made for someone to sit on and having four legs that roughly extend down below the horizontal surface and reach the floor. And so if that passed all the requirements for patentability, which again, it would not, but if it did, it's different enough from the three-legged stool that this four-legged stool gets awarded a patent based on a horizontal surface and four legs. Okay, so now a patent is awarded for the four-legged stool. However, the claims for the three-legged stool say a horizontal surface, which the four-legged stool has. It says for a user to sit on, same for the four-legged stool. And for the three-legged stool, the claim says it has three legs extending to the floor. Well, the four-legged stool also has three legs extending to the floor. It doesn't have an additional one, but it does have three. And so in fact, it practices all the claims of the three-legged stool. And so even though that four-legged stool got issued a patent, they would be infringing on the three-legged stool patent and therefore could not go to market. They do not have freedom to operate. So you can get a patent awarded, but not have freedom to operate. All right, one more. So freedom to operate, no. One more simple non-medical example to illustrate this point. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a mountain bike. I don't even know what brand this is. I just pulled this image off of the internet. And let's say on this mountain bike that the inventors have all kinds of patents on the shape and the design of the frame, of aspects of how this rear suspension system works, of the way that the fork works or something like that. So they have all kinds of patents that are issued on aspects of this design. So that's great. This company goes out and celebrate. They have multiple patents awarded. Fantastic. However, there may be another active patent that is for this contraption here. Now, again, this is one of the original, it's an image from one of the original patents for a bicycle. So this is long expired and is not active. But for this example, let's just say that this patent was still active. All right. This patent might say a two-wheeled vehicle that has a metal frame, that has a seat attached to it, handlebars, and a drivetrain which the user pedals. All right. So even though the mountain bike might have 5 patents that were issued for that company, it still has 2 wheels, a metal frame, a seat, handlebars, and a drivetrain that pedals. And so they would not have freedom to operate. So again, patentability, not necessarily freedom to operate. So a company can have an issued patent, but not freedom to operate. So when you get those patents, when a new company gets the patents issued, what a new company can do is to go to, again, a reputable intellectual property law firm and have them offer a freedom to operate opinion. And this is a way to add value to the company, to get someone to say, hey, we looked at all the prior art and we think that you can go to market and you're not going to be infringing on other claims. All right. So again, very important for building value through intellectual property. All right. What else? So another way to build a lot of value as a startup is by demonstrating efficacy and, depending on the product, safety as well. Looking to determine initially whether there are FDA guidance documents in the United States for establishing safety. If those exist, they can actually help to define the regulatory pathway and the requirements for establishing safety, and that can be very valuable to a startup. Looking also to see whether there's benchmarks in the literature for establishing efficacy. Now, some products, if it's a totally new product, a totally new market, totally new application or indication, these may not exist. But for the vast majority of medical devices in the United States, there may be other products that are similar to them. And so the FDA may have a guidance document that has been published telling the inventors what they need to do to establish safety and or efficacy. And the first step in demonstrating safety and efficacy and value is undoubtedly laboratory testing. And that may be simple benchtop testing. It could be very complex. It could be something that takes an hour to do. It could be something that takes months to do. Based on the results of that testing, if possible, and not all laboratory or bench testing is publishable, but if that is worthy of publication, I think that adds a lot of value. And I'll come back to that in a second and why I said that. After laboratory testing, if appropriate for the device, perhaps doing animal testing. That animal testing, again, there may be guidance documents or benchmarks or standards for what should be done. And that can be in small animals, basically rodents, mice, or rats, or moving into large animals, which are more clinically relevant and translational. And again, if those results demonstrate efficacy and safety, it can add a lot of value by publishing those results. And then finally, a clinical trial, either a clinical trial because it might be required to get clearance or approval to go to market. So it could be required as part of the regulatory process, or even if it's not required, even after regulatory, doing a limited launch, a limited clinical rollout can be extremely valuable for raising the value of the company. And I think one of the very important things there is designing the clinical trial in such a way that the company can make marketing claims later. Okay, for example, these marketing claims want to be used later on in the marketing of the product to extol the virtues of the product and the competitive advantages. If the clinical trial is designed properly, then maybe the manufacturer can make claims saying the performance of new product is superior to old product. The trial could be designed differently to just say it is not inferior. Maybe it costs half as much, but it's not inferior to an existing product. Or to make a claim saying that it works faster or that it's easier to use or whatever the case may be. The claims that a company can make regarding its products are defined explicitly based on what conclusions can be drawn from a clinical trial. So designing the clinical trial appropriately can actually add a lot of value to the company. And again, publishing those results becomes very important and can add value, right? So each step from laboratory testing, animal testing, clinical trial, reduces risk about the product and adds value to the product with each step. Now, why publish? Why did I say that? A couple different times I said that was important. Do big companies generally care about publications? Big company may not care about publications per se, but if the end user is a clinician, the end users generally care a lot about peer-reviewed publications. Something generally has a high level of credibility if it's published in a medical journal or an engineering journal or something like that. And so a company will, publishing will add value to a big company because the end users, the clinicians who might be using this product, will see value in that publication. So I think indirectly, that's a very important way to build value. All right, then there is the regulatory process. And again, this is something we talk for hours or days about. Going through in the United States, either the clearance or approval process, depending on the type of product. And there are many, many steps here and many ways to add value. And I'm just going to go through a few of these things. So first is determining exactly what the regulatory pathway to market is. You sit down with, when big companies sit down with very early stage companies, undoubtedly the first question or one of the first questions is, what is the regulatory pathway? How are you going to get this to market in the United States through the FDA? So that is largely determined by what class the product is. And sometimes this is very obvious from the very beginning of what class a product is. Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 in the United States, with increasing risk going up to Class 3. Most products being Class 2 in the United States. Determining what class can be very obvious, but sometimes, I go back to our implantable sensors application, and that was not necessarily clear. When we're adding some technology to, for example, an implant, by putting a little wireless sensor on it, does that change what class that device is? So sometimes this is very obvious, and other times, if it's a totally new product, new indications, it may not be obvious. And then going into the FDA and figuring out what product codes and guidance documents are available. How well defined is the regulatory pathway for a particular product? And the FDA has a website that's very easy to go in. It's a product classification database. I put the link here and just grabbed an image from the website itself. Where by going in and just putting in a description of the device, a whole bunch of information comes up about what class it is, what product code it is, and then from that product code, guidance documents and other information about the regulatory pathway can be obtained. All right. So for Class 2 devices, again, very common for medical devices, that can go through a pathway frequently, which is called a 510K. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but a 510K essentially says that we're going to just establish that our new product, new company's product, is substantially equivalent to a product that's already out on the market. And that product that it's going to be compared to is called the predicate. And so even identifying what the appropriate predicates are adds value to the company as far as defining the regulatory pathway. Now, sometimes getting access to those predicates is easy. They can be obtained off the shelf. Sometimes they're very difficult to get. In the case of an implantable device, for example, that may be very difficult to obtain. And one of the ways to obtain those is perhaps through a new company's medical advisory board members. If they're clinicians and end users, they may have access to other companies' products, which could be used as a predicate for a new company. All right. So there's a lot of strategies, and just having this pathway defined and some of these questions answered adds value. Along the way, having meetings with the FDA, what's called a Q-sub meeting with the FDA, to confirm the regulatory pathway, to go over some details, to make sure that new company is on the right track. After these meetings, it is the company's responsibility to generate minutes from the meeting and to send those to the FDA and get those minutes approved by the FDA. Just having some of that documented in those minutes and getting the approval by the FDA, again, can add a lot of value to a new company when they're trying to build value for acquisition. And of course, ultimately going through and doing the regulatory submission, putting together all the documents that are necessary with all the data. That's a huge milestone. And then waiting for the response back. And obviously, if the device gets cleared in the United States, that's reason for a huge celebration. And then thoughts about what the outside of the US strategy might be, getting a CE mark in Europe, for example. So again, with each one of these steps, some risk is reduced and value is added, especially with respect to a big company coming in and looking at the value of a new company. Regulatory is very important, obviously. All right, what about reimbursement? So reimbursement is often overlooked. I think a lot of people who are innovative, who are inventors, they think if the product that we're going to make, the new company's product is better, then the market will pay for it. And unfortunately, the reality is in 21st century medicine that is not true. And so reimbursement and finance becomes a very important part of it. Just really understanding who is paying for the device becomes very important. So again, for example, most devices are paid for by the hospital, by the clinic, whatever it's going to be. And then the hospital or clinic gets reimbursed by the third-party payers in the United States. That might be Medicare, it might be a private insurance company, whatever it is, by billing through CPT codes, current procedural terminology codes. And so with a new product, it's very important to determine, are there existing CPT codes that cover that product? Because if the new product is not going to be covered by an existing CPT code, then it may be difficult or impossible for the hospital or the clinic to get reimbursed for the cost of that product. So knowing whether there are existing CPT codes becomes very important. For a disruptive product, one that's going to be used in an existing market, but maybe has better features than existing products, there's likely an existing CPT code. However, if there isn't an existing CPT code, this becomes a very long process, multiple years to get a new CPT code issued. So also, does a new product, does it add CPT codes? Now you say, okay, if it adds CPT codes, does that mean it's going to be adding costs? Well, if the hospital can bill for additional services because they're using a new product, that may not be so bad for the hospital, right? Because they're making some money on that. However, if they're passing that along to payers, the payers may not be willing to pay more or may not want to pay more, and that could cause trouble for adoption and reimbursement of a new product. What if the new product actually removes CPT codes? For example, maybe it's a new procedure that eliminates the need for certain imaging or follow-up diagnostic studies. And so the hospital is not going to bill those CPT codes, but maybe the hospital actually made some money on those CPT codes, and so they might actually lose revenue by removing those CPT codes. So again, that could be troublesome with respect to market adoption. And I think even worse than that is, does perhaps the new product add expenses without adding new CPT codes? Is it more expensive? That which could be trouble because it costs the hospital money, or perhaps maybe does it add time without adding new CPT codes? A lot of minimally invasive surgical procedures, for example, actually take a lot longer than the comparable open procedure. And so it reduces efficiency and subsequently costs the hospital money. So something like that could also be troublesome for adoption and reimbursement. However, in light of where it might add or not add or take away CPT codes, if overall, does it add value? If overall, does it reduce costs? Even if you're shuffling CPT codes around, ultimately at the end of the day, if the hospital is reducing costs by using the new product, that's good. And that becomes, then adds a value to the new product. And of course, then looking at what the reimbursement is relative to the cost of goods. Very expensive new products might not be reimbursed to the hospital at any higher rate than an inexpensive one is. And so if the cost of goods is higher for the hospital, higher for the new company, then again, the margins may not be as good and the overall value for the company may not be as good either. All right. So finally, last thing that I want to touch on for adding value is manufacturing. Right. So again, especially if it's a new technology for a new product, are there manufacturing methods that are well established, or are new manufacturing methods necessary when someone, maybe big company, is going to take this and scale up. What manufacturing methods are going to be needed? Are there going to be non-recurring engineering costs with setting all those up? Who will manufacture it? Is it going to be internal, or is it going to be a contractor? Will the new company set up internal means for manufacturing, or the big company that's going to acquire it? Will they set up internal means for manufacturing, or are they going to go with a contractor? And I put the MDDI logo up here. That's a medical device and diagnostic industry, which is a periodical that represents manufacturers who manufacture medical devices, third-party manufacturers. So there's a whole slew, it's a whole business for doing that. So there are a lot of contractors that might be able to do the fabrication. And again, one of the things that is important that we've learned during COVID is that supply chain can be challenged. And so I think a company is going to need to make sure that in order for a new product to have value, that there can be redundant sources, redundant manufacturers who can actually make it. And then going from prototyping and small batch sizes to scaling up. Is the process scalable? If we're talking about traditional manufacturing methods, maybe it is. If we're talking about something that's a lot more complex that involves biological or chemical processes, that might be much more difficult to scale up. And without knowing whether that's scalable, the value for acquisition from a big company taking that on may be intimidating. And again, of course, the cost of goods and the lead time. How expensive is it to manufacture? What are the margins going to be on the product? And how long does it take to make one? Is it something that, again, using traditional manufacturing methods can be banged out very quickly? Or is it something that, if it's biologic or chemical based, takes a long time to fabricate? And one of the things that I found when going to big companies to talk about the value of a startup or a product is that obtaining quotes from third-party manufacturers adds a lot of value. So when you say, oh, this device is probably going to cost $100 when we scale it up, that's very different than having a quote from a manufacturer that says, we will charge you $100 to make this per unit when it's at scale, right? So again, manufacturing considerations can add value to a startup as well. So in summary, how does a startup add value for acquisition? By demonstrating need, showing that end users want it, by developing an intellectual property portfolio, both having a patent strategy for the United States and also outside the US in relevant markets, by establishing the efficacy and safety of the product and publishing that, because that generates value for the end users, obtaining regulatory clearance or approval, either in the United States or again in whatever other markets may be relevant to that particular product. And getting clearance and patents in countries outside of the United States may be important because a lot of the big companies have an international presence. And so although their biggest market may be the US, they want to also be able to market this in other countries where they have existing marketing and distribution channels. So regulatory and intellectual property outside of the US can add a lot of value as well. Again, as we just talked about, defining a reimbursement strategy, making sure that that exists. There are classic examples of products that have gone out on the market. There's been no reimbursement and they have just not gotten any traction. And then finally, establishing manufacturing channels to make sure that scale up is possible. So these are the main points that I think are really important for adding milestones and value to a startup. I also have two tips that might seem more minor, but I think are important as well. One of the tips is to really start as a startup, start very early, having a dialogue with the big companies. I would go and identify what all the companies are that are the big ones in the space that may be future acquirers. I would start having conversations with them at the point when the intellectual property and the ideas are safe, that patents have been filed or issued or whatever. I would share the development milestones and the plans with them, keep going back and getting in front of them. I think that helps to build a recognition for the startup company, for the founders or individuals who are the leads at that company, by meeting milestones and coming back to them and saying, hey, 6 months ago, we told you we were going to do this. Look, we did it. That helps to build credibility. And it also, by getting back with them, helps to keep checking in to see how new companies' products match with the strategic initiatives of big company. And the strategic initiatives may change, and they might change in favor of new company. They might change away from new company. Finally, last tip, as a medical device startup, I think that having a quality system is super important for adding value. Quality systems are no fun. They slow the process down. It's a lot of paperwork, but very important, because the quality system is all the documentation and the support for all the progress that the company has made, especially with respect to regulatory. And the big company does not want to have to go back through the FDA process or whatever regulatory process it is, just to be able to bring that product to market. If new company has a strong quality system, then all the details should be there, all the support should be there, and it makes it much easier for a big company. And because it's easier for big company, it adds value. So I hope that this was enlightening and provides a framework for how a startup can add value for acquisition. I'd like to thank leading entrepreneurs of the world for inviting me to give this talk. And I'd like to thank my colleagues and all the people who have helped me along my career to get to the point where I have some knowledge to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Great job. Great job. Wow. 6 tremendous milestones for everybody to keep in mind. And your last 2 tips, I think, were outstanding as well. Kind of, again, being in front of the big guys, early and often. And even though, as you said, sometimes quality slows things down, it's one less thing for them to worry about, right?
Exactly right.
They don't have to go back. They don't have to go back and do it. It's interesting. Your JLabs story earlier on was interesting, because it certainly continues to affirm that corporate entrepreneurship is alive and well, right? Inside the big guys, you've got the opportunity sometimes in these particular units to be able to get creative and innovative, which is really just terrific. With your CPT code piece, I've been in consulting for a long time, and it reminded me of an instance where I had an opportunity to add some value, right? Work with the company, create a new engagement, and we wound up getting bogged down on, well, do we have a code for that? What should we call it? We don't have anything that matches. Well, sounds like a good idea, but how do we go? By the time we figured it out, the opportunity 6 or 7 weeks later, well, sorry, thanks anyway, it solved itself. So we wound up losing the opportunity to engage with someone once, because we got hung up on the coding and what we were going to call it. It's interesting. Reimbursement always in healthcare and medical device, it always somehow bubbles up and surfaces to that, because at the end of the day, as you said, people want to know who's going to pay for it, right? I mean, I've experienced, certainly over, even with just services in general in the medical community, things that are now mainstream 25 years ago, well, that's experimental. We're not going to cover it.
Yeah. Right.
And it's like chiropractic, for instance. Yeah. And it's like, what?
It's tough, because, some company has to be the pioneer. They have to be the first ones to do this. There's certainly some value in being the trailblazer, so to speak, to being the first one on the market. But it also means that issues like regulatory and reimbursement, that there may not be a well-defined path. And so I think it's very important to try to identify those things early on, so that investors, founders, have a really good idea of how hard is this path going to be. Are we, are we in the thick jungle and we need a machete, to make, 3 feet of progress? Or are we going to follow a path that exists already, that we're just going to improve, when we get there? And so I think these are some of the questions that a startup can really address early on, so that they're not scrambling at the end to try to find the answers when everything else is hot, and ready to go.
In your experience, how accessible are the testimonials on the user acceptance side? Do you find the people you're working with more than happy to do it? Do they want to stay under the covers? How does it typically play out?
I think that's a really good question. And I think, generally going to clinicians that are in an academic environment, they may be a little more accepting of new technology. Generally going to clinicians, and I think that there's two different questions to ask, right? One question is, would you use this? And, and give me a commitment to using it. That's a tough question for a lot of clinicians until they see all the data and, you go through all the regulatory process and all the safety and efficacy is done. Another question is, do you think that this has potential and is it really interesting? So getting the first letter or testimonial, whatever you want to call it, where they're saying, I commit to using this thing, that's much harder. And I think that there's a much higher benchmark of what clinicians want to see before they'll get to that point. And so there are certain who have mentality that would say, you know what, I understand what you're trying to do. I believe that this thing is going to be better. And so I'm willing to be an early adopter of it. And there are others that say, look, I'm very comfortable with what I'm doing right now. If it's surgery, my complication rate is low, and I'm going to ease into this. And I want to kind of see, what happens before I commit to it. But getting a letter that says, hey, I think this is really interesting and has high potential, I think if what you're doing makes sense and the clinicians, if there really is a need for improvement, I think that's a much lower bar. And I think clinicians will provide those, either letter or, video or in person. And that it has a lot of value. It has a lot of value.
It's interesting on again, some of these milestones, they're almost like conjunctions. As you said, patents are important, but so is the freedom to operate. Right? Clinical trials are critical, but so is the publishing of the results, right? Yeah. So it's interesting how they get coupled. I was particularly struck what you said early on as well, that new and cool doesn't necessarily equal value, right?
I will tell you that
certainly in the artificial space, right? When you think about it.
Yeah, and I will tell you that as a biomedical engineer and a former professor where I try to get students, excited about innovation and creating new technologies and things like that, it's very frustrating to have to say that just because it's cool and innovative doesn't mean that it's going to be successful. But that is the reality of medicine. And so, I think there's sort of two things. I think of this, you can either have a product that's based on a technology push or a market pull. Right. And a technology push is you discover a new technology in the lab and you say, how this has to be, useful for something, and you figure out what that is. And I think the other, which is a market pull, is where you identify a need, you identify where there's a problem, where there's a limitation, and then you figure out a technology or a way to fill that need. And I think when you're talking about the second one, the market pull, it's much easier to get clinicians to say, oh yeah, I'm excited about this because there's definitely a need for it. When you create a technology and you try to push it on and figure out where does this have value, that potentially is a much more difficult pathway, in my opinion. And I mean, there's been some great successes of technology push, but I think generally market pull is a much easier path to success.
Yeah, and your last milestone on the manufacturing side again kind of underscores that at the end of the day, if you're going to market it and you need the product, you have to have the ability to build it.
Yeah.
Right. And partnering with people or otherwise makes the most sense.
Yeah, the way I see all these is I sort of see them all being wedges in a pie, if you will. Right. And like you said, they all interact. They're all, they have to fit together. And what I see is that they're wedges in a pie. And what happens is that the pie initially starts off and it's small, and then each of the wedges sort of together has to grow and grow and grow and grow. And if one of them grows faster than the others, then the pie is not going to be good. I don't know. It's a terrible metaphor, but maybe you understand what I mean.
I get it. One last point, and I found this interesting, and I was curious your view on it. You mentioned early on as well that, again, the management skill set is often different for a startup versus a scale up. If you're the entrepreneur and you're out there in the forefront doing this, and you want to take it to the next level, it would strike me that it would take sometimes courage to admit that, I'm not the next person. I'm not the best person to take it to the next level. Have you often run into that? And do you see people then adding a new partner to the mix or a new member of the management team? Have you seen that play out over time?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of it depends. A lot of times, if the leadership team are the technology people, the engineers, I think that they, get to a point pretty rapidly in the process where they might realize, I need someone with a lot more experience in the business or the marketing or the management or, whatever it is, and go out and try to identify that person. I've also seen startups where they will have a very heterogeneous advisory board, right? So they'll have maybe two separate advisory boards, one medical advisory board of the clinicians, but then also have their advisory board that are made up of industry professionals who have experience. And those industry professionals may have experience in all different areas. And if it's a good advisory board, though, they should cover the entire spectrum. And so maybe then either a person from the advisory board comes and steps into a role if they have experience in scale up, or they help to advise the leadership team and say, look, now is the time to go and find someone to help with that scale up part. So, as an engineer, I'm very comfortable in the technical world, and I've learned about regulatory and patents and everything, over the years. The whole business and management side of it, there are people who have a lot more knowledge than I do, and I'd rather go and find them and use their expertise and their experience so that we don't make a mistake along the way and do something that we're not supposed to and kill the potential, of the company. So I think a lot of it depends on what the makeup of the leadership team is, what the makeup of the board is, and what everybody wants to get out of it.
No, that's a great point. I've done a lot of capital markets work in my lifetime, and when you look at some emerging public companies, those especially in places like the biotech space and things, you often see two boards. You'll see your traditional board of directors with all of your strong committees, but then you'll see that scientific advisory board or medical board. And they play just as an important role sometimes as the typical fiduciary board, as it plays out. Well, listen, Eric, this was fascinating. Thanks for joining us again. It's always a treat. You're so well versed in this. These were some amazing observations and steps for our audience, and we thank you once again for being here today, and wish you continued success, and look forward to seeing you again next time. Okay.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Thanks.
Good care.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You
Bye.
too.